Hi everybody, welcome to our Compass Box tasting table here in our blending room in London. Today we kick off a month of celebration, a month of events, tastings, collaborations, everything virtual of course, to commemorate 20 years of Compass Box. It's difficult for me to even say 20 years of Compass Box. The time has gone by so quickly. Well, and I can think of no better whiskeys to help us celebrate this than these two here tonight. We're going to taste Hedonism, the classic Hedonism, the whiskey I first created to launch this business. And we're going to taste Hedonism Felicitas, our most recent limited edition, now being shipped to the markets all around the world. And I know that a lot of you struggled to get it. I apologize for that. We'll talk more about that later. But there just wasn't a whole lot made of it. But in any case, whether you've got both bottles, whether you've got one bottle, whether you've got neither of these, maybe you've got something else, grab a whiskey in any case and join us over the next hour or so while we talk about these whiskeys, while we talk about some really cool food pairings to go with these whiskeys that are really simple, and I know some of you have all prepared those in advance, and we're going to take your questions along the way, okay? We'll take your questions throughout the evening. Let me start with some introductions. To my left, at a responsible social distance, is our whiskey maker, James Saxon. James was lead whiskey maker on Felicitas, so he's going to help me talk about that in more detail. Across the table, we have young Alex Driver, our marketing assistant. Alex is going to help us with questions, asking questions that are going to be fielded from Karen, Pete, and Scott, who are in their homes right now. From our team. Here's the team, the Compass Box team. This is back in January when we had our all-company meeting in Seville. Karen, Pete, Scott in that picture. They're going to be fielding your questions tonight. They're going to answer them in real time if they can. And then they're going to be forwarding some into Alex here, and Alex will ask myself and James, and we'll field them here. And don't worry, if you send in a question this evening that doesn't get answered, we will compile all the questions and answers and publish those on social media over the course of the next week or so. All right? So, with that in mind, let's start a whiskey tasting with whiskey tasting. If you've got Hedonism, the classic, pick up your glass now. If you don't, pick up whatever you've got, and let's toast to 20 years of trying to make the world of Scotch whiskey a more interesting place. That's why we exist. Cheers, folks. Vanilla, hints of coconut, a little bit of baking spice. Hedonism, why grain whiskey? Why did I start a Scotch whiskey company with a grain whiskey? Let me take you back 20 years. Let me take you back even further than that. When I got into the world of Scotch whiskey, I wanted to be a winemaker when I got out of university. That was my dream. And then I morphed into this desire to become a whiskey maker. I got hired into this world of Scotch whiskey by a brand called Johnnie Walker, and they moved me from the U.S. to London, 1998 that was. And I was becoming a geek about Scotch whiskey at this point, and blending whiskeys in my kitchen, really trying to understand everything I could, read every book that I could put my hands on back then. One of the things we did working for that big company is we would frequently taste the components of the blended Scotch whiskies that we were selling. So, some of you know malt whiskey. In Scotland, there's two whiskeys made, malt whiskey and grain whiskey. And when you put those together, you've got blended Scotch whiskey. And I will never forget being at a tasting of the key components of Johnnie Walker Black Labels, as it was. And we were tasting 12-year-old grain whiskey from the Cameron Bridge Distillery, aged in what we call a first fill American oak bourbon barrel. Means it was the first time it had ever been filled and aged a whiskey in Scotland. Prior to that, it would have been an aged American whiskey of some sort when it was a new barrel. But I just found love with this grain whiskey. What you're getting in this glass right now, if you've got one, is all that vanilla character. You get toffee even and caramel, and it's just so easy to like. I remember bringing the glass into from the tasting room to the dinner we had that night and saying, "Hey guys, why don't we bottle this? Why don't we bottle grain whiskeys on their own? Show the world how delicious this style of Scotch whiskey could be." And people didn't. My colleagues at the time sadly didn't think that was a very good idea. People don't know what grain whiskey is. or they've never heard of it, or those that do have heard of it think it's the cheap filler in cheap blends. And I said, well, if that's what they think, they'll never change their minds unless somebody proves otherwise. Anyway, I didn't win that debate. And fast forward a couple of years, and I decided to start my own Scotch whiskey company. When I started Compass Box, I wanted to start it with a whiskey that would surprise people. I wanted to start with grain whiskey. I wanted to start with a side of Scotch whiskey, an aspect, a facet of Scotch whiskey that most people, even serious Scotch whiskey buffs, didn't know anything about. And that's why I did this. On October 23rd, 2000, my dear wife Amy and I, she was pregnant with our first son Josh, we drove up from London to Elgin, and we bottled the first Compass Box whiskey. And this is one of those bottles, bottle 345 out of 690. We stayed at the Highlander Inn the night before, and I painstakingly hand-numbered all of these labels that went on the bottles the next morning at Gordon and MacPhail. Our good friends at Gordon and MacPhail bottled it for us on the morning of October 23rd. Filled the boot of the car with cases of whiskey. Amy and I got in and drove down to Edinburgh and went straight to Royal Mile Whiskies, and I sold my first 2 cases of Scotch whiskey to Kearsord at Royal Mile Whiskies. We'll come back and talk about Royal Mile a little later. But that's how the business started, with grain whiskey. What is grain whiskey? Now, I know a lot of you do know what grain whiskey is, but I just want to, just for the sake of everybody, getting everybody up to the same level, let me just give you a little primer here on Scotch whiskey. There are 2 kinds of whiskey we distill in Scotland: malt whiskey and grain whiskey. Malt whiskey, made from malted barley, distilled in copper pot stills, right? Well over 100 different single malt whiskeys. It's a single malt distillery making malt whiskey today in Scotland. Grain whiskey is whiskey that can be made from a variety of different cereals. The defining factor of grain whiskey in Scotland is it's distilled in a continuous still. Okay? And people have been making grain whiskey since the early part of the 1800s. It's distilling malt whiskey for 500 years. Grain whiskey since the early part of the 1800s, when the continuous still, the coffee still, was first patented. And the difference of the 2 spirits is in flavor and weight. So malt whiskeys tend to come off the still around 70% alcohol. Grain whiskeys, made today from either wheat or corn, maize, depending on the distillery, with some barley. Grain whiskeys in Scotland today tend to come off the still, the continuous still, at over 90% alcohol. Okay? So what that means is grain whiskey is a much lighter, more delicate spirit, fewer flavor materials than malt whiskey. But flavor materials, indeed, it's not neutral. Some people think, oh, grain whiskey is neutral. It's not neutral at all. And the various different grain whiskey distilleries in Scotland each have their own distillery character. Just like malt whiskey, it's got to be aged in oak casks for a minimum of 3 years. Yeah. And when grain whiskey is aged, same with malt whiskey really, but when it's aged in really good quality casks that haven't been used too many times, and we like the first fill, what we call first fill casks. They've been seasoned, used for the first time, typically in America. Come to Scotland, the first time they're filled, they can create whiskeys like this. Just so easy to like. So approachable, and that's what I wanted to do with Compass Box. Is one of the things I wanted to do is make Scotch whiskey more approachable to more people, make the whole world of Scotch whiskey more interesting, but make it more approachable to more people so that more people can share in the joys of what I think is one of the world's great drinks. So that is grain whiskey. James, you want to join me? We'll get into this hedonism in a little more detail. What are you picking up in there?
It is a lovely nose. It's a great whiskey for a Sunday evening.
It is.
You're right when you mentioned at first the vanilla, those toffee caramel notes. Sometimes I get a hint of coconut, batch to batch, but this one I'm getting a lovely aroma of elderflower. Mm-hmm. But then on the palate, the 43%, the non-chill filtration, just really rounds everything out, and you just get this incredible, voluptuous, sort of creamy, very delicate overall delivery. It's really nice.
One of the things we do here in the blending room, and right over there is our freezer, is I'm sure there's a bottle in there right now, we put bottles of hedonism in the freezer. Now, it's getting into cold weather where we live, around in this part of the world, but in the warm weather months, it's really fun when people come to visit us here in the blending room. We will very often, we take out these little, tiny, little, beautiful liqueur glasses, and we'll fill up shots of hedonism from the freezer, and that weight, that silkiness on the palate you're talking about is just accentuated. Okay, you put whiskey in the freezer and it does kind of close down some of the flavor you're going to get, but the enjoyment is enhanced in terms of how it feels on the palate. We describe it as kind of like melted vanilla ice cream, you know, in your palate. It's pretty extraordinary stuff. Anyway, versatile. Hedonism. Right. Alex, we getting any questions yet?
We do, actually. Greg asks, hi John, there have been many mash bills for the core hedonism bottlings over the years. How have you managed to keep the same nosing and tasting notes over that time?
Yeah, very good question. We'll in a moment we'll bring up the recipe wheel for this, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But so mash bill is different. What we're doing is buying grain whiskeys and malt whiskeys for that matter, folks. We're just doing grain whiskey tonight, and for those who are new to Compass Box, we make malt whiskeys, we make grain whiskeys, we make blends of blended Scotch whiskey, a blend of malt whiskey and grain whiskey. But it's grain whiskey tonight. We buy whiskeys from various distilleries across Scotland. And over the years, we have bought aged whiskeys from them, already aged. It was about 8 years ago, going on 8 years ago, when we started, in addition to that, sourcing casks, and we travel around the world, literally, to source great quality casks and different styles of casks and bring them, ship them to the distilleries to be filled, with new spirit and aged for the future. When we're buying grain whiskeys, most of what we're buying today would have been grain whiskeys made primarily from wheat, with some barley. The really old ones, or in the case of North British, would be made from corn, maize. North British runs corn and maize, but about 25 or maybe more years ago, distilleries in Scotland, grain whiskey distilleries switched from using primarily corn with barley to wheat with barley. And that was a cost decision back then, sad to say. Today, most of the grain whiskey distilleries that are running today are running wheat. So I hope that answers that question. Should we talk about this batch? We've got a recipe wheel to share with you. Right, on our website, you will see diagrams like this one for every whiskey we make. For every whiskey we make, we've done this from day one. We're very open about what we use what we put into the bottle. Historically, a lot of companies in Scotland would say, well, our blends, our recipes are secrets, and we would. But I always thought, especially coming from the world of wine, where winemakers tend to be very open about, what they're doing. I just always thought, getting into the world of Scotch whiskey, why wouldn't we be open? Increasingly, people want to know and understand the decisions that the makers have made to create these products. Increasingly, people want to understand, where does the flavor in that glass come from? What parts of the process? So we've been very open from the beginning. So here is, you'll see on our website, for every product, diagrams of the recipes. On the back of hedonism labels is a batch code. The back of hedonism labels is a batch code. And you can take that batch code, go to the website. From 2014 onward, we've got all the recipes, okay? If you come across a hedonism from before then and you're interested in the recipe, just email us and we'll look it up for you. But every batch of hedonism, stylistically over time, we're trying to maintain consistency. We're trying to and we have maintained a similar style to that very first one I bottled 20 years ago. But because we make hedonism in small batches, the smallest batches of any of our core products, there will be slight differences batch to batch. Overall, kind of like differences in vintages in wine. But we're trying to maintain consistency, this soft, sweet on the palate, vanilla-laced style that we've been describing so far. So that's our aim, and we keep benchmark bottlings in here. And James, much of your work for not just hedonism but all our core products is tasting cask samples as they come into the office from distilleries and trying to pick the ones that will be appropriate in this case for hedonism, and then creating small-scale prototypes and then tasting those against our benchmark, and that's how we maintain consistency over time, or attempt to maintain consistency over time. But we acknowledge, we're totally open about it, there will be slight differences. Back to the diagram, if you don't mind. So 3 components in this parcel. The parcel, or the batch that we have in the blending room tonight is 2019A. And it is made of simply these 3 parcels. There will be several casks within each of those parcels from the Cameron Bridge Distillery, first fill bourbon barrels. That's 16 years old, that parcel. Then 2 different parcels from the North British Distillery, one from first fill American oak bourbon barrels, and the other from recharred American oak barrels, okay? Now, the ages of those, you're wondering? Well, until about 5 years ago, on these diagrams, you would have always seen the age of all the individual parcels. But 5 years ago, someone reported us to the Scotch Whisky Association for doing so, saying there's a law, an EU law, that says that you can only, a spirits producer in the EU can only talk about the age of the youngest component in a blend. Now, we challenged that, and some of you will be aware of our transparency campaign from several years ago, where we went to the industry and said, let's think this through, and let's consider changing the law, okay, for producers like ourselves who are trying to give 100% of the information, not trying to mislead anyone. We should have the right, not necessarily the obligation, but the right to tell people the age of all the components, because a 5-year-old grain whiskey is going to have a lot different character than a 25-year-old grain whiskey. And so people have a right to understand, what to expect from these products. But we were not successful in changing the industry's point of view on this law, and Brexit hit, and that distracted a lot of people. And we will revisit this issue with the industry in due course. But that is the situation we're faced with now, which is why you don't see us publishing the age of all the components. We are, however, by our lawyer's advice, able to communicate the age of the other parcels if we're asked. If people say, well, can you tell me, you told me the youngest, can you tell me the other component, the age of the other components? In that case, we're entitled to communicate that information. Any new questions, Alex?
Yes. Someone asked, are we allowed to tell about the ages involved, and can we tell them about the ages involved in hedonism?
So, well timed, and this happens frequently in our tastings. Yeah, we can. If you ask, we can tell you. These are not state secrets. And if you go to the next chart, you'll see that the 2 older components are 21 years old, James, and 24. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what you get here is similar to what we got in the very first batch, where I took the very first batch of hedonism was from the Cambus Distillery, sadly now closed, at 10 years old, and from the Caledonian Distillery, also a closed grain whiskey distillery at 20 years old. And what we were doing is trying to create a style of grain whiskey that had the depth from the older parcels and the fruit and the brightness and the energy of the younger parcels, and create balance that way. That's the idea. Right. Shall we move on to Felicitas? Yeah?
Let's do that.
James, take us through this. This was your baby. Let's start with rarity. I know I feel so bad, especially in this country, in the UK. It's been hard for people to find bottles of Felicitas. We weren't able to make a lot of it, and we do have a lot of friends around the world that we needed to allocate it to. But talk to us about quantities and I guess the rarity of this.
You're right, John. This was a project we knew we were going to want to work on. 20th anniversary of Compass Box means surely an anniversary hedonism. And we were taking time to source the right parcels and ensure that what we had in the bottle was compelling. We want everything that we produce to be compelling.
Compelling. Yes.
And when it came to hedonism Felicitas, 11 casks, and I've got all of the cask samples here beside me. 11 casks altogether came to 2,226 bottles.
Yeah.
But for those like us who have managed to track one down and you've got one in your glass, congratulations, and I hope you'll join us in appreciating some of the flavours that we have here. I think immediately if you've got both glasses poured with classic hedonism and with Felicitas, you should immediately see that there is a greater amount of, you could say, potency in Felicitas. It's bottled at 53% ABV versus hedonism at 43%. And we'll discuss a little bit more as to why a little bit later. But the aromas for me are there's even more aged character going on here. There's some of that brown sugar, there's some apple, there's some of that vanilla as well, toffee. Every component is bringing something.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and taste it, and then I want to come back and we'll talk about creative process and how we got here and the various parcels and what they're delivering. But yeah, if you are able to taste the two side by side, you'll see immediately there's a color difference, which is suggestive of the greater age of Felicitas. And of course, all our whiskeys are natural in color. We don't color them with spirit caramel, sadly many producers do in Scotland. But darker color, bigger, more effusive aroma in the nose, and when you get it on the palate,
yeah, a lot going on. Great texture, similar to Hedonism, very creamy. But I think there's a greater degree of the oak involved, but there's still some of those components still do give a sense of the actual raw spirit in terms of some of the raw materials. There is a cereal character going on here, and that toffee note, which I think owes a lot to the parcel from the Port Dundas distillery, just really delicious.
You want to take a look at the recipe?
Please, yes, if we can have the diagram up here. So we talk about 4 components in this whiskey, the most significant being a 19-year-old parcel from the Port Dundas distillery. You mentioned, John, the first Hedonism, 2 closed distilleries. The Port Dundas distillery in Glasgow is no longer operating. But then we have whiskies from North British distillery in Edinburgh, and then another significant component is whiskey from Strathclyde distillery, also a Glaswegian grain distillery.
Cask types?
Well, this was a bit of a surprise for us. We thought we were going to be putting together whiskies which are very much in the classic Hedonism style, coming from barrels primarily, maybe a couple of hogsheads. And it turned out that the Port Dundas, which is 44% of the recipe, was actually refill sherry butts. So a very uncommon cask style for grain whiskey. But we feel when we were tasting them, they behaved in a very similar way to bourbon barrels. We just had a little bit of extra depth. We suspect they might the butts might have been filled several times. But with the quite heavy character of Port Dundas new make spirit, after 19 years, you still get this incredible depth of vanilla character, a little bit of spice, and a perfect way to anchor this whiskey.
People frequently ask us about the creative process. How do you come up with your whiskeys? Let's take folks through that process for Felicitas. Number of prototypes, the length of time we worked on this project.
So the way we develop recipes here at Compass Box is understanding what great parcels we have and can we bring them together in an interesting way. We started the Felicitas project in August last year, at a very different time, and we went through 31 recipe iterations, and each iteration comes in a little bottle that looks a little bit like this. So very small amounts. What we're doing is we're creating prototypes of 3, 4, 5 components at a time, tasting as a team. Myself, you, John, Elif, our head of operations, and Jill Boyd, our whiskey maker as well. And we're all discussing what's working, what can be improved. And so, 31 conversations to get to Felicitas.
Yeah, and it's a lot of work, and a lot of it takes place right here at this very table, and we've got our new blending room next door as well. But it is painstaking process. Many mornings I come in here, and James will be sitting here with dozens of bottles like those in front of him, tasting through all those casks, those cask samples, pulling together the ones that he wants to use, and measuring quite small amounts of them into measuring cylinders, and creating these prototypes. And then we like to let those prototypes after blending sit for a couple of days and let the components come together and kind of knit together. And then, as you say, we get together, we taste, and we talk. And that's the key thing. Talking about it and talking about our impressions, what we like and what we don't like and why. That's the process we go through. And we track each of those prototypes. James creates basically a spreadsheet, a worksheet for each of those. And you can look across 20 or 30 or however. Sometimes we've needed to make many more prototypes to finish a whiskey over many more months than this. But you can go back and look through those worksheets and spreadsheets and see a story. Sometimes, we take start with an idea and take it this direction, and we're like, oh, this isn't working out. We'll back down a little bit, change some things, and go off in a different direction. So it's very much the old thing attributed to Picasso, which was, I start with an idea and then it becomes something else. This is the process here. The name, Felicitas. I love the name. Another question we frequently get is, how do you come up with the names for your whiskeys? And so Felicitas, I just love this name. It is this word. It's an old Latin word, and it means essentially it's the idea of a condition of divinely inspired productivity or blessedness or happiness. And that's why you see this picture of these old Roman coins. And this is 297, I think, if I recall correctly, 80. But in any case, the coin on the right says Felicitas Temporum, which roughly translates to this idea of reminding the citizens of the empire what a wonderful, divinely inspired, blessed time they live in. But this idea of productivity, blessedness, happiness, just kind of ideal for an anniversary whiskey, I thought. How do we come up with names? Well, for this one, James, remember, we had everybody in the office basically throwing in name ideas and going through them. And sometimes that's how we do it. Sometimes we just start with, wow, we've got an idea and we've got a name for it, and bam, that name sticks forever from the beginning of the process. Very often we get working on a whiskey like this one, and the name comes later. And so we just couldn't come up with anything in the office. And Michelle, our project manager, she took it to her father-in-law and a friend of his, and Phil and Patrick are amateur writers, and they came up with a list of names for us and sent them in with Rochelle, and Felicitas was on there, and we just kind of reacted in the same way to it. It's like, this is perfect. This is a perfect Compass Box 20th anniversary name. So there you go. Yeah, cool name. Right, Alex. Anybody any questions coming in?
Yeah, we've got a few actually about the chronology of the Hedonism releases and what it might look like in the future. So from Graham, he asks of the future with Scottish grain whisky distilleries closing or having closed in the last 20 years, how will the small range affect future CB blends? But on top of that, we have Tony asking about the progression from Quindecimus to Muse to Felicitas. So lots of from the original Hedonism to the current and beyond.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll address the question around grain whiskey closures, and while that's happening, James, chime in if you have anything to add. That has been happening. Many of the grain whiskey distilleries currently still running have increased capacity. So the overall capacity for distilling grain whiskey in Scotland has actually grown over the last couple decades. So there's lots of whiskey out there, and there are some there, and I hope there will continue to be small players making grain whiskey in Scotland as well. As for the question on the various hedonism releases over the years, there's over on the shelf over there, there's several of them. I mean, it all started with this. And we've had various label changes over the years for our classic hedonism, from this to this. But also we have done, as he points out, various limited edition versions of hedonism to celebrate various things. A 10th anniversary version. We did a special Maximus years ago. The Muse a couple years ago, and Quindecimus. Yeah, so where are we going with all this? Well, it's such a touchstone for us, grain whiskey and hedonism, that every once in a while we just, when we get access to special old parcels, we'll put together a limited edition hedonism. So it's really on the basis of being able to find them. And I will tell you that over the last 20 years, finding the kind of super high quality parcels, super delicious parcels of whiskey that you need to make something like Felicitas, it is becoming harder and harder. Because some of those big distilling companies that own those whiskeys want to keep them for themselves. Right. What else do we have, Alex?
Graham asks, do you have a favourite grain whiskey, like with Clynelish single malt?
Do I have a favourite grain whiskey? Yeah, I have Canvas. I loved the whiskies from Canvas, and we drew on Canvas for the very first Hedonism and subsequent releases and the early batches of Asila. Some people remember that. It was a smaller grain whiskey distillery compared to others, at the time when it was closed 25, where are we, 30 years ago? More? Yeah. Do you remember the date it closed? Was it 80?
I don't.
80s? But it was closed. I was told by a man who works at the distillery I was in touch with when I first started Compass Box. He was so tickled that we were using whiskey from Canvas. It was known to blenders as having this lovely softness and delicacy and so forth, and a lovely, it was something that blenders highly regarded at the time. But it was closed because it wasn't as efficient as some of the other grain whiskey distilleries owned by that company at the time. Sadly, was what I was told. But Canvas, yeah, love Canvas. And it was actually an old signatory bottling of Canvas back in well before I started Compass Box. An old signatory bottling of Canvas. It was probably 30 odd years old. Was one of the things that really, drew me into the world of older grain whiskeys and how delicious they can be. So, there you go, for what it's worth. What else do we have?
Kim asks if we can talk about the artwork on Felicitas, and Paolo asks if we could talk about the creative process around the labels and packaging.
Sure, yeah. We've been working with Stranger & Stranger design agency, London-based with offices in New York, San Francisco, for over a dozen years now. We work really well together. We've got, we know each other's rhythms, ways of thinking, and we can give them very simple design briefs, and they, most of the time, hit it out of the park, first or second go-round. And and what I like to do when I'm giving a design brief to the agency is I like to kind of distill the whole thing down. Usually they're a couple pages long, but I like to distill it down to one sort of core idea. But with Felicitas, that idea was 20th anniversary, and platinum came to mind as something that people give as gifts for 20th wedding anniversaries, and that's kind of where this whole idea for this label started. And Guy and the folks at Stranger came back with they originally came back with this sort of rather dystopian world around the woman's head. Remember, James, we were saying, this is really cool. It's extraordinarily beautiful and strange, but let's make it more utopian rather than dystopian, more in keeping with the kind of outlook, the sunny outlook we like to have in our business. And that's kind of how that project was shaped. Yeah. I will tell you that when this first label, this was done by Chris Edmonds, designed this, working with my old friend Bob Thwaites 20 years ago. And I remember telling them when we created this label, I said, guys, I'm going to do something different in the world of Scotch whiskey, and we're going to bottle a grain whiskey, and that's going to be different, which we talked about. And I said, but I want to, and with a label inspired by the world of wine, which I had come from. I said, I want this design to look like nothing else ever before in Scotch whiskey. And I remember telling him, I want you to take it out to Pluto, back when Pluto was a planet. And this is what Chris came back with. Yeah, and I loved it. I love this whole idea. And this woman, as far as we know, the first time a woman's face has ever been on a label of Scotch whiskey. No one in 20 years has been able to disavow me of that. So if someone can, please do. But I thought that was important. Another question before we move on to food?
Absolutely. We have Gear asking, do you use STR casks or will you use them in the future?
James, over to you. STR casks. What's an STR cask?
Well, an STR is shorthand for shaved, toasted, and recharred, and they are very exciting casks to use. They give a great amount of flavour and texture. A cross between a recharred bourbon barrel and a wine cask is sort of the best way of putting it. And yes, we do have some casks filled not with grain whiskey, but with malt whiskey. Going into STRs, and that's for one of our other products that we launch or release year round. So as John may have said, we don't just release grain whiskey. We also have our malt whiskies too, our malt whiskey collection, and the Story of the Spaniard is one of those. So we have some malt whiskey which is finishing and has been in there for more than a year now in STRs, and we're keeping track of that.
I mean, we do every year. We were talking about this last week and making plans for fillings next year and finishings and recasting and so forth. We do every year. We're trying different types of casks or different suppliers of various types of casks, and we have a lot of trials, as Elif can tell you, a lot of trials going on in Scotland. And what we're trying to do, I was saying this to someone last week, we are chasing the deliciousness. We're always trying to discover new ways to create deliciousness in Scotch whisky, that compelling character that James mentioned earlier. Compelling character that calls you back to the glass, and just, inherent deliciousness is what we are trying to do. Speaking of deliciousness, let's get the food out. Let's do some food pairing here. Okay, so some of you out there, I think we sent out some instructions suggesting, hey, if you want to take part in the cheese and chocolate pairing that James and John and Alex are going to do, get some Parmigiano Reggiano. If you can get your hands on some salted caramel chocolates or salted caramels or just chocolate, then you can taste and pair along with us. Okay, we love stuff like this. I do love matching food with whiskey, and I've been doing it since before I started Compass Box. But we've been doing cheese and whiskey pairings from the beginning. And Parmigiano Reggiano, I will tell you, is just such an extraordinary all-rounder. But it has this particular affinity for grain whiskey. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to taste enjoy some hedonism, classic hedonism with Parmigiano Reggiano. My recommendation, and you can do this any way you like, my recommendation for food and whiskey pairings is that you start with a sip of the whiskey and get the flavors of the whiskey on your palate. Then the food, and then go back to the whiskey. It's the same thing you would do if you were doing wine and food or wine and cheese pairings. Get the flavor of the liquid on your palate, bring in the food, and then bring back the whiskey in this case. And you'll start to experience amalgamations between the two sets of flavors. Sometimes you'll get complementary things going on, sometimes contrasting things going on. But Parmigiano Reggiano, I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world. Somebody pops over and you don't have any nibbles, any snacks, any food, but you've got this little wedge of Parmigiano Reggiano. Grab your knife, just chip it off, put it in a pretty bowl, serve them a glass of hedonism. We like serving whiskey in wine glasses. Nosing glasses are great for nosing, but wine glasses allow you to get your nose in. The thing about a nosing glass is you can't really fit your nose, put it to your mouth and get your nose in it because it's so small and narrow. Wine glasses really show off the whiskey well. So, shall we?
Let's.
Just a touch of the whiskey on the palate, and then a piece of the cheese. And back to the whiskey, and then there's going to be this mini explosion. Oh my God. So now I'm getting the vanilla of the whiskey is amplified, and the creaminess of the cheese is amplified. It's just so cool.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Lovely grassy notes as well.
Yeah, we'll bring out the notes of the cheese. I want you to take up whiskey and cheese pairing. Having worked in the world of wine and still being a huge wine geek and fan, I will tell you it is easier, generally speaking, to match whiskeys with cheeses than it is wine with cheeses. Wine, with cheese, there's a lot of, things that just don't work together, and it takes some work to kind of get great pairings, but whiskey's a lot more friendlier, I guess. That is, I can still taste, and I've still got the aftertaste of that amplified creaminess from the cheese and the whiskey. It's just so good, yeah. I do sometimes this is perfect at this strength, and we didn't talk about strength, but we'll touch on that between these two. I very often do prefer to add a touch of water to my whiskey when I'm doing whiskey and cheese pairing, but it just depends on the whiskey, it depends on the cheese, it depends on your mood. But I do find when you start adding a bit of water to it, with whiskey and food pairing generally, it starts to lower the alcohol and the hit, that kind of burn on the palate. And it makes the whole pairing a little easier, and opens up flavors in the whiskey that are otherwise kind of locked into the solution at the higher strength. So experiment and play around and see what you like. Right. Shall we move on to chocolate?
Definitely.
You've been doing quite a lot of chocolate and whiskey experiments recently, I've noticed. And you actually found out some interesting. Weren't you doing hedonism and different kinds of classic hedonism and different kinds of chocolate recently?
Sure, yeah, because for us, we have some great chocolatiers nearby in London. One of the perks of being based here. But salted caramel chocolates are not easily found everywhere. But yes, I've discovered that hedonism with a good milk chocolate works deliciously. Hedonism with a good dark chocolate, 70% cocoa, also works deliciously. So whatever you have at home, if it's chocolate, it probably will work.
With hedonism.
With hedonism, yes.
Right. All right, Felicitas. Higher strength. Yeah, we didn't talk about strength, did we?
No, and it was a crucial part of the creative process. We prototype a lot of our whiskies at 46% alcohol by volume. But then as we discuss things and as certain flavours start to emerge during the prototyping process, we do ask ourselves, would this work better at a different strength? And if you look across our portfolio, we have a wide variety of strengths at which we bottle, and that's usually where we feel the whiskey drinks best straight out of the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
There is always not.
It's subjective, is what we have to admit.
Yes, it is subjective. But between the four of us, we think that at this strength, this whiskey is showing fantastically out of the bottle. There's no need to pour it out and then find an extra balance. It's already there in the bottle. And for Felicitas, we tried it at 46, and as much as we were enjoying the flavours, we remembered the Muse. The Muse bottled at 53.3%, and we thought, what would this recipe be like taken up a few notches? So at 53, the flavours really sang. The concentration of flavour was just what we wanted for this project.
Yeah, so it's not cask strength, but it is a strength that people would think is cask strength, 53. But yeah, I say subjective. There are subjective decisions around strength, but sometimes, as you've just explained with Felicitas, at a certain strength, the whiskey just, as you say, sings, in a sweeter way than, a more compelling way than the other strengths. Right. Those salted caramel chocolates are staring at me. It's time, I think. All right. These have slightly liquid centers, so we're going to have to pop them in one. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge mess. But here, you go first, and I'll talk. Again, yeah, whiskey on the palate. And Felicitas, they're beautiful. These whiskeys, what you get when you go from classic to Felicitas, you just get greater concentration of flavor. There's more complexity here. The higher strength, I think, and James will tell us as soon as he's done chewing, the higher strength of Felicitas ought to work really well in cutting through the richness, the fattiness, if you will, of this chocolate. Okay, right.
Yeah.
How's it work?
It's delicious. It's delicious.
Chocolate and whiskey, there is an affinity there.
The way the whiskey and the cocoa powder, which is slightly on the surface of the chocolate, work together. Again, it's a really fantastic texture, but the way the vanilla sort of comes in waves is really enjoyable.
So this is in a sense really easy too. You've just finished a meal, and you want to have one more, the wafer thin mint kind of thing, and it's just so easy. Salted caramel chocolate, an old grain whiskey like classic hedonism or Felicitas, and people are just going to melt into their chairs. It's beautiful. It's such a simple but beautiful, soon-to-be classic food and drink pairing, chocolate and whiskey. Alex, young Alex.
Yes.
I can call him young Alex because I've known him since he was 7 years old. Questions?
So rather than a question, Greg mentions that he didn't have any Parmesan, but he did have some Comté, and it worked very well with the...
yeah, that's another great whiskey cheese, for sure, yeah.
And Anna asks, do you find, and this is on flavour, do you find that modern barley and grains provide higher yields but are less savoury than a few decades ago? And how much does grain quality figure in the decision to make a whiskey?
Well, that's a technical question that I'm not going to be able to answer, James. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but of course what we're doing as a blending house is we're buying whiskeys from various distilleries, so we aren't making the decisions around choice of barley, or even necessarily, or even distillation methods. So that's not something that we get into. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but we can put you in touch with people who can answer that question.
Yes, obviously we don't specify the grains that are used in the whiskies we make. All we get excited about is when a sample comes in that's delicious, and yeah, whether that's been created from a certain variety of barley or a certain variety of wheat or not, the quality is there. We don't go so far back down the chain, although we're obviously as whiskey fans interested in that, and I think it's fascinating what's happening around the world with varieties of barley and where barley's grown. But no, for us with Compass Box whiskies, whatever has come out of the cask, whatever brilliant combination has been created with spirit and cask and time, if we can celebrate that, we will do so.
Yeah, I mean, we are a blending house. We are whiskey makers, but we're not distillers. I like to think that, years ago we did look into distilling, buying a distillery, building a distillery, and it's a different business. And it also, what I love about what we do, carrying on this tradition of the Scotch whisky blending house that goes back to the 19th century, what we do, we're able to source so many different things and gorgeous things, and it gives us this tremendous platform for being creative. I admire distilling, and as a retirement project, might have a little still puffing away in my back garden one day. But right now, I love what we do. I love the ability to reach across Scotland and source different whiskies from different kinds of distilleries. And what we do at the end of the day is we're creating across our portfolio, across all the. You saw the first slide when before we started. We've made well over 100 whiskeys in 20 years. Yeah, well over 100 whiskeys. And it allows us, blending and sourcing from different distilleries allows us to make things that are proprietary to us, things that no single distillery can create. And I love that. What else, Alex? Any other questions coming up?
Callum has a question for James. How did it feel taking the lead on Hedonism Felicitas, with Hedonism having such a rich history? He also mentions it's delicious, by the way.
Well, thank you, Cal. It was an incredible opportunity. I've been a fan of Compass Box for a lot longer than I've been employed by Compass Box, and to work on a hedonism project was very, very special. I was actually working on both hedonisms at the same time at one point, because we needed to create a new batch of our classic hedonism. So I was getting a lot of grain whisky samples and a chance to see what different whiskies from across Scotland were doing. So I really enjoyed putting the whiskies together, and yeah, the way those 31 iterations developed and what we learnt along the way, and the little twist at the end with the cask type of the Port Dundas. Every project has a surprise and a learning in it. So it's been fantastic to work on Felicitas, and I'm really enjoying seeing people opening their bottles when they get them.
Yeah, I met James when he was at St. Andrews University years ago, when he was president, I think, of the
Quake.
Yeah, Quake Society.
Yeah.
I go up there almost every year to do tastings, and I love it. And people do frequently ask us, how do I get in the world of Scotch whisky? How do I get in the industry? How do I become a blender? And there's no single path or way. There's not even a program to join here and become a blender. You get into the world of Scotch whisky and you become a blender and a whiskey maker by having just a sincere passion and interest in the product. And James' story, I think, is a good illustration of this. Falling in love with whiskey in university, and well, you can tell your own story about how you got here, but you just keep knocking on doors, and things happen.
Yeah, whiskey's a fascinating industry to work in, and I'm so lucky to be part of it. And I do not have the classic technical background, but yes, I make up for it with, I hope, enthusiasm. We're always experimenting at Compass Box, and a chance to lead those trials is fascinating. But yeah, a wonderful thing to be a part of, to have so many different things to work on, and whiskies from all over Scotland to bring together. I find that so creatively sort of fulfilling, and it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and here are two guys who studied literature at university. So you didn't have to have a technical background to do what we do. Anyway, there's no single path. It's just you worked in bars that served whiskey. You got to work as a brand ambassador for a big brand, and were sent around the world and showed that you had an interest and acumen for nosing and assessing whiskeys, and that brought you into their blending room, and that brought you to Compass Box. So there's no straightforward path. It's just following your passion. I know that sounds like a cliche, but I think there's real truth there. Technical. People ask why hedonism. Why did you call a whiskey hedonism? I liked it. I thought it was different than anything else in the world of Scotch whiskey at the time. And somebody, when I was putting together the ideas for Compass Box, accused me or suggested that I took more of a hedonistic approach to whiskey assessment than a technical approach. This idea of following deliciousness. And I took that as a compliment. And I said to the fellow at the time, that would be a pretty cool name for a whiskey, hedonism. That's where it came from. Right. Alex, anything else? Another question? I think we might have time for one more.
Clark says, congratulations on 20 years.
Thank you.
What is your vision for Compass Box for the next 20 years?
Our vision for Compass Box in the next 20 years. I find it kind of difficult to even say 20 years. I've been doing this for 20 years. It's just gone by so quickly. But what I can tell you is that I feel like we are, as a business, as a team, we are just getting going. We are just getting going. I think that, the next 20 years, next 10, 20 years, it's going to be more of us continuing to try to pioneer and discover new ways to create delicious whiskeys. It's going to be us continuing to be open, transparent about what we do, in order to give people reasons and understanding for relating to what we do. We're open about it, not just for the sake of it, because we know that helps people create a bond with us because they understand better the way we think. We're going to continue to share our ways of thinking, our ways of enjoying great Scotch whiskey. More of that. And if you think about it, I said before, we only over the last, it's going on 8 years since we started filling, sourcing our own casks, bringing them to the distilleries, filling them for the future. And as more and more of those whiskeys start to make their way into our bottles, our products are going to get ever more exciting. So I am as excited about the next 10 and 20 years as I ever have been over the last 20. And it's, starting your own business, a lot of people know it's not, not every day is all sunshine and happiness, and there's challenges in managing a small business or any business. But overall, I couldn't be happier in what I do for a living, and I can't wait for the next 10, 20 years. Continue doing it. I hope that answers the question. As we wind down the session, a couple of things I want to mention. October, it is our birthday month. So do look out on social media and in our newsletters for the various collaborations, events, tastings we'll be doing over the course of the next 4 weeks or so. Next week, next Friday, the London Whiskey Show launches, and we're heavily involved in that. Later in October, we're doing 2 special anniversary tastings with Royal Mile Whiskies. I told you earlier about how Royal Mile Whiskies was the first place I ever sold Compass Box. And to honor that, to commemorate that, we're doing a 20th anniversary virtual tasting with them over the course of 2 nights, dipping into our archive of old whiskeys to share with folks on that. So look out for that. And we'll be doing other events and tastings and things with our distributor partners and retailers around the world over the course of the next 4 weeks. So look out for all those things. Also look out for this, Peat Monster Arcana. This is the last of our 20th anniversary limited editions. This is shipping to markets now around the world. Another James Saxon creation. Thank you very much, James. Very much in concept and liquid, James's creation. There'll be probably another session when we'll take you into the details of this. That's coming out. And also, I want to point out our fundraiser is still active. Look to our website for details on our fundraiser to help. There's a picture of some of the things you can purchase, and all proceeds from those go to help charities supporting hospitality industry workers who've been hit so hard over the last 6 months because of the COVID situation. Our fundraiser still goes on. Thank you, James. Thank you, young Alex. Karen, Pete, Scott out there, thank you very much for helping us out. And I want to thank all of you for tuning into this evening London time. Over 36 countries, hundreds of people signed up for this from 36 countries around the world, which I'm flabbergasted by, but so very grateful. We only exist because of you. And I want to say thank you for your support and your belief and your appreciation of what we do at Compass Box. And here's to another 20 years of working to make the world of Scotch whisky a more interesting place, and hopefully in doing so, making your lives that little bit more interesting as well. If we achieve that, then we're doing our job. Thank you all very much, and good night from Compass Box in London.